The lower zone is typically where you find a small version of the mix console. The mix console is the mixer of Cubase. And so if we come down here to the lower zone and look at it, we can see our inputs, our outputs, as well as all of our individual tracks. Each track in Cubase up here in the track list has an associated channel in the mix console. And you can tell them apart by the selection of the track or the channel. In other words, if I click on the bass track, you'll notice that the bass channel gets highlighted. Or if I click on the Halion-Sonic instrument track here, then the instrument track gets selected. So it's easy to see those track and channel associations. Now, there is a full mix console that you can find under the Studio pull-down menu and going to Mix Console or by typing F3. And so it's a big version of the mix console where you can see all of the channels, as well as the things like the audio routing, the inserts, and the equalizer, and so forth. But sometimes when you're just working on the composition of a project, you don't need to have all of those mix-centric sort of parameters visible to you at all times. Plus, the mix console itself takes up a giant portion of one monitor. And so for two monitor people, it's nice to have the mix console, this big version of it, on a separate display with the lower zone hidden. But if you're on a one monitor system, it's nice to just have the standard parameters that you'll want to grab quickly here in the lower zone. So you can adjust things like the volume, you can record enable, and you can solo and mute and so forth. But not only do you have the faders themselves, but you do have access to the audio and MIDI inserts, and you can get to the send effects as well. And at the top of the list, there are the three little lines. If you click on that, then you'll reveal the toolbar. And the most important features here are the undo and redo, which are separate from the project window undo and redo. But for now, I'm just going to turn those off and get back to our faders. So if you wanted to adjust the level of something, it's very easy. And I already recorded a little ditty into Cubase here so I can show you how the faders work. And you'll notice that each of the fader knobs is a different color. The input and output knobs are red. The MIDI track is in its off position, and there's a reason for that, which isn't really germane to what I'm going to talk about now. But the important thing here is that it's kind of a beige color, whereas audio tracks are blue, kind of a sky blue. Instrument tracks are kind of a creamy color, and that color coding helps you see what kind of track you're working with. But let's get some playback, and then I can adjust the levels. There's the bass, the organ. Rewind here. Mutes and solos as well. If I wanted to solo just the bass, or hear it without the Halion-Sonic organ. But there are other settings that you can find. This is just the mix console. You can also look at the editor, sampler controls for sampler tracks, and chord pads for chord tracks. But let's look at the editor right now. If you click on the editor, you'll notice that there's nothing visible in the lower zone. And what you'll need to do is select something in the project zone, and that will reveal the data that's associated with that track. Since this is a MIDI track, we're looking at MIDI information. But if we select an audio track, then we'll see the audio information. And if you click on an event from an instrument track, because as I mentioned before, an instrument track has a MIDI front end and an audio back end, then what you'll see is the MIDI information for that track. And you can edit individual notes, for example. If you needed to change that note to a different note, or if you needed to make the note longer or shorter, you can do that here in the editor. And if at any time you need a bigger version of the editor, you can come over to this little arrow button, and that will open the editor in a separate window, so you can really get in there and edit all of that information in a much larger window. Then when you close that window, it gets back to the project window. For those of you that have two monitors, it's nice to be able to turn off that lower zone because you may want the MIDI editor in a completely different window. And there are different views to each editor. You'll notice that there's a little caret next to editor right here. If you click on that, then you have a choice of different editors depending on what kind of track you have selected in the editor. The default is the key editor. There's also a drum editor and score editor. So let me go to my drum track right here. And if I look at the drum editor, then here's a different view of the MIDI notes themselves that are a little bit separate from the melodic editor. And then if we go to the score editor, then we'll actually be able to see the notes themselves. I'm going to change this to a drum track. Then there's also the controls for the sampler tracks, which we don't have right now. And there's also chord pads for the chord track, which we'll also get to in a whole separate course. And next, let's talk about the keyboard focus.